Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, first of all, I will be introducing a bill in a minute called S3053, but as a kind of a predicate to that, let me talk again about my ongoing investigation of the overreach of the Environmental Protection Agency. Certainly the Washington Post is right on with their editorial. On May 3rd, the Washington Post editorial board penned an editorial entitled, quote, "The EPA is earning a reputation for abuse." Now, in this editorial, they discussed how the former Region 6 administrator, Al Armendariz, philosophy, quote, philosophy of enforcement, unquote, has severely hurt the EPA. Now, to refresh your memory, it was a couple weeks ago at this very podium that I read the quotes that I'm about to quote you again today. And while the Washington Post doesn't agree with me all the time, I was pleased to read that they saw that the crucify policy Mr. Armendariz reported in his visit to Dish, Texas, clearly showed that he preferred to extract harsh punishments on an arbitrary number of firms to scare others into cooperating. And further, the Washington Post editorial board saw this attitude as both unjust and threatening to investors in energy projects. Now, while Armendariz has resigned, he's gone now, his statements have undermined the legitimacy of the EPA's regulatory authorities. Now, we know that the policy of extracting harsh punishment on arbitrary individuals in order to scare others into cooperation was not just an inflated rhetoric. Mr. Armendariz followed through on his philosophy when he had the EPA Region 6 pursue a trumped-up emergency action against a natural gas company, Range Resources, in Texas. The EPA is not using its power fairly and showing its enforcement is arbitrary, unreliable, capricious, and unduly severe. But the Post editorial board didn't see Armendariz as an isolated incident. They also called out EPA's actions in other recent high-profile misuse of power that has hurt the agency's credibility. EPA insisted that an Idaho couple, the Sackett's, stopped construction on a home because that violated the Clean Water Act. Now, on March 21st, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously. This was not a split decision. It was unanimous, 9-0. The EPA had exceeded its authority in pursuing the Sackett's and was ensured that they and other people who find themselves in similar situations can overcome the EPA's assertion of whether or not their property contains jurisdictional wetlands without submitting to the permit process. A mere 2 days later, the EPA was again called out for overreaching their authority on water issues. Then on March 23rd, the U.S. District Court ruled the EPA overreached in revoking a permit to Arch Coal after the Army Corps of Engineers had already granted it. And in quite a blow to the agency, the judge said EPA's claims, and I'm quoting now to what the judge said in his order, that, quote, that Section 404 grants in its plenary authority to unilaterally modify or revoke a permit that has been duly issued by the Corps is a stunning power for an agency to arrogate it to itself when there is absolutely no mention of it in the statute, unquote. That's what the court said. Yet in the midst of scathing rebukes from the press and the courts, EPA is still acting as if everything is the same as it was before. These cases happen, and they're actively pursuing more regulatory power by attempting to vastly increase the scope of the Clean Water Act's reach. In fact, when discussing the results of the Sackett case at an American Law Institute American Bar Association event on May 3rd of this year, Mark Pollins, director of EPA's Water Enforcement Division, said, and I'm quoting now, "Internally, it's the same old, same old. I plan to send a letter to the Administrator Jackson addressing Mr. Pollins' comments and trying to find out how an EPA official in the face of a 9-0 Supreme Court decision could say that the agent's not going to do anything different." And if the EPA is able to finalize their new Clean Air Act jurisdictional guidance, it will have given itself a whole new set of excuses for pushing the boundaries of the Clean Water Act as far as possible. This continued overreach is why we now have bicameral, bipartisan legislation introduced to stop this current guidance overreach. Let's take a moment and go back in time to where this all started. We might remember a couple years ago, Senator Feingold from Wisconsin, Senator Overstar, Congressman Overstar over in the House, introduced the Clean Water Preservation Act. The Clean Water Restoration Act removed the word navigable. Now, in this act, it gave the federal government, through the EPA, the jurisdiction over navigable water. And that was what the law was. Well, they wanted to take out the word navigable, and therefore the EPA would have jurisdiction over all land in the United States. I mean, it's very simple, and it was so unfair that not only did we defeat the Clean Water Restoration Act, the people defeated Senator Feingold in Wisconsin and Congressman Overstar after they'd been in for a long time. So obviously this is something that is not popular. It is an overreach, and everyone understands it. Now, normally when the Obama administration can't achieve what they want to achieve through legislation, they do it through regulations. We see this in cap and trade right now. We see that the president tried to get legislation on cap and trade, which would have amounted to a $300 to $400 billion tax increase on the American people. It wouldn't have done any good. It wouldn't have helped anyone. And yet, it would have been the largest tax increase in history. I go back and compare what they were attempting to do to the Clinton-Gore tax increase of 1993. That's where they raised the marginal rates. They raised the capital gains tax. They raised the death tax. This massive tax increase, that was a $32 billion tax increase. This would be 10 times greater than that. Now they're trying to do what they couldn't do with legislation through regulation. But that's because in order to take a Clean Water Act rulemaking, EPA would have to follow a transparent process and engage in a public comment period, as required by the Administrative Procedures Act. For that reason, they didn't pursue to do that through through regulations. Given how unpopular their proposal has been, going through with the rulemaking would make it much more difficult to obtain the expanded federal control that they're clearly trying to pursue. By changing agency practices in this formal and non-regulatory way, they virtually ensure that they will be able to formalize this agenda easily through future rulemaking. So what they couldn't achieve through legislation, or in this case, through the proper rulemaking, they're trying to do through guidance would provide no improvement to water and would likely real progress on cleaning water. The guidance board broad reach and legalistic language will inevitably shift the balance of regulatory authority for which are better equipped to protect waters within their borders. Now, given the federal government's control over nearly all, will not lead to cleaner water. It will lead to tremendous uncertainty, tremendous confusion, and economic. Senate Agricultural Committee and 39 of our colleagues to Administrator Jackson, where we raised our concerns that this document went far beyond than mere guidance. The engineer greatly expanded what they can be considered jurisdictional waters through a slew of new and expanded definitions and through changes to the applications and jurisdiction test. Administrator Jackson has said that this guidance will increase the Clean Water Act scope In the economic analysis that accompanied the guidance, it stated that as few as 2% and as many as 17% of the non-jurisdictional determinations under current guidance would be considered jurisdictional use using the expanded tests under the new guidance. However, this analysis was only for the Army Corps making dredge and fill permit decisions when compared to current practice. Now, the guidance will apply to the entire Clean Water Act, including the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits, the Oil Pollution Act, and spill prevention control and countermeasure plans, water quality standards, and even state water quality certifications, because most states have delegated authority under the Clean Water Act. This change in guidance will also result in a change in the responsibilities of states in executing their responsibilities under the Clean Water Act, and a change in how individual citizens are governed by law. So what we're talking about here is what they've been unable to do with legislation, they were going to be doing with regulation. But in this case, what they really couldn't do with regulations because that would be too transparent, they're trying to do through guidance. The finalized guidance document is currently at OMB for formal interagency review before it's finalized. And we don't know what changes have been made, but based on a draft that was leaked to the press, it doesn't appear that the document is substantially different from the proposed guidance document that they put out for public comment last May. Now, this is the last step before this expansive document starts being used throughout the country. And that's why I hope all my colleagues here in the Senate on both sides of the aisle will join me in trying to stop it. Now, working with Senators Brazo, Senator Heller, Senator Sessions, and others, we introduced S-2245. We called that the Preserve the Waters of the United States Act, a bill that stops the EPA from finalizing the guidance and from using the guidance to make decisions about the scope of the Clean Water Act or to turn it into a rule. The House has also acted with chairmen and ranking members of the Transportation, Infrastructure, and Agriculture Committees, introduced a bipartisan H.R. 4965. I applaud Mr. Micah and Mr. Rahal in this bipartisan effort, Mr. Lucas and Mr. Peterson and Mr. Gibbs for their actions. These bills do not change or roll back any current protections under the Clean Water Act. They simply stop the EPA and the Corps of Engineers from moving forward and making these unprecedented regulatory changes through a guidance document. The EPA needs to withdraw this guidance document immediately. If it wishes to make changes to the Clean Water Act, it should go through a complete and proper rulemaking process under the Administrative Procedures Act. That's why it's there, so that people will know in America the cost of what these regulations mean to them and what they do and do not do. So why do it under the veil of guidance when they should be doing it out in the open? And that's what we want. And that's all really that we're asking for. Now, I mentioned that I'm introducing